like to introduce to you Dr. Brad Agel. He is a PhD from University of Washington, and he subsequently went on to University of Pittsburgh, where he became the professor for ethics and leadership, and then he went on to become the professor for ethics at the Brigham Young University in Utah. I've had the pleasure of knowing him for many years, and that's why it was the best opportunity to have him here on this occasion of the Ananta Aspen Center Everest lecture series. Let me just tell you quickly about Ananta Aspen, that this is an organization which forms thought leadership. Our idea is to encourage all us Indians to think, and to think hard, and to make the world a better place, and to make a significant change in the way we think, in the way we operate, in the way we do business, in the way we go about our daily lives as well. So it's a pleasure for our company, Everest Industries, to be associated with Ananta Aspen for this lecture series in Mumbai. The big ethical dilemma which we faced was that, is it okay to host a talk on ethics in a bar? And we thought that, if your objective is clean, and I went through his 13 dilemmas of the recently to be published book, and I said, I think we fit in okay. So we approved of this venue. This really a huge pleasure for us to have all of you here. And speaking with Dr. Brad Agel, who is here with his wife Christy on their first trip ever to India. So you can imagine that apart from the overwhelming barrage of sense that, to the senses that India provides to you, the amount of ethical issues that he is going to see, face and hear about, over the next 1 week that he's here. So it's great. We need more people like that to come into India and to speak to us about it, and to understand our ethics, and to understand where we are doing things right and where we can do better. And moderating this session is going to be my dear friend from the Aspen Fellowship, Anuj Podar, who is the head of Viacom. And the media industry, as you know, in India and in most parts of the world, really practices a very high degree of ethics. And so it's going to be even more fun to have. No, it's not tongue-in-cheek. Okay, if you think otherwise, then it's your problem. I do feel that the media has a good role to play, and I do think that our friends in the media, our media do a good job. All right, so Anuj is truly one of the really, really ethical media people that we have in our country. And it's a pleasure, it's an honor, sir, to have you here. Welcome to India, and welcome to the Aspen Everest Talk Series.
Aditya, I don't know if you were being tongue-in-cheek on the first part or the second part when you referred to me. So I'll rather not ask it, rather than comment. I think, like Aditya said, ethics in India have a very love-hate relationship with each other. And let me just start with sharing a scenario that I think all of us see on the roads every day around us. Just imagine it's a Sunday morning. You are on the roads, and the roads are rather empty, and you hit a red traffic light. And what you'll see usually is, let's say there are 5 or 6 or 7 cars at that red traffic signal. And then you see the roads are rather empty, and you wait for 10 seconds, and then that's when your patience starts running out. And then, guess what? The first, the second, and the third car actually decides to jump that signal. And they do it because they can see they're not coming in anybody's way. And the second thing they see quickly is that there's no cop out there to actually catch them as they jump the signal. And they go on. And now let me ask you this, and you are the guy sitting in the 4th car, and answer honestly, and you see everybody else go by, and how many of us choose to then stay on for another 10 or 20 seconds? I mean, let me ask you, would you stay on, or do you end up driving by and jumping the signal? How many of you would jump the signal and go ahead? Just raise your hands. How many of you would go ahead? Okay. And how many of you would stay?
A, but then jump because the guy behind will honk.
Exactly. So here's what happens. Some of you decide it's not worth it, and you will decide to jump the signal like everybody else is. Some of you decide to stay, and you start thinking you're a loser. Or if you don't think you're a loser, the guy behind you thinks you're a loser and tells you what's wrong with you, get to move on. And this is a classical ethical dilemma that we face every day in our average, ordinary lives. But this is very representative of what an ethical dilemma is in the course of our business lives, our organizations, our corporations. It's not always, it's a choice. I mean, I don't think you intended to break the signal when you left home in the morning. But you come to that signal and then you have a choice to make. Then for a while you're not sure what choice to make, and then you make a choice that later you think, was it or was it not the right choice? So I just want to share two things before I give it to you, Brad. One is I believe that ethics is a matter of attitude or a principle. It's not a choice. I mean, you believe in it or you don't believe in it. It's what you choose to believe in. But having said that, and I think most of us as kids, or I hope our kids, are born with or given the right ideals and told that these are the ideals, this is right. And then as we go along in this journey called life, we start becoming practical. And practical is just a euphemism for making compromises, starting to re-question our values, or compromise on some of these values, and start questioning the ideals that we started off on that journey with. And this conflict or tension between the ideal and what's supposedly the practical is actually when you are in a dilemma. So I believe that everybody's intent is good, but everybody with the right intent also comes across these dilemmas of what's the right thing to do in a particular situation. And as all good Americans have a solution for everything. They're very structured. They have a framework, A, B, C, D, E, F, figure out which of these actually applies to you, tick the right box, this will tell you what happens. So as a good American, Brad has very nicely put out all of these, his, I think, 300 case studies into 13 dilemmas. Those of you who have these, the program brochure from this evening, there's those 13 dilemmas printed on that typically most situations would fall under. And I'll leave Brad to talk more about that, but before that. The second point I wanted to make is about us, India. While he's a good American, this is not about America. So many of us good Indians think this is all nice for the good Americans to talk about. It doesn't matter to us because it's a different economy, because the US system is a more evolved ecosystem. You're dealing with a marketplace or a government or a system that is more ethical in general on the outside. It's less corrupt than many of us in the environment that we live in. And therefore, is it hard for us to follow these notions or principles of ethics in our more corrupt or less evolved ecosystems? Or maybe there's a right time to do that in the future. But again, I believe there is no right time. The time is now. As we live even in what's a more challenging or supposedly corrupt ecosystem, I think it's to our advantage to follow the ethical framework. As we build fast-growing companies, businesses, as we grow fast, the sooner we can learn from the West and from their lessons and not repeat the mistakes, and imbibe that ethical framework into our businesses, I think it makes for building a stronger, healthier institutions, more sustainable businesses, more sustainable corporations, and ultimately it adds to shareholder value. So I'll stop at that, Brad. Let me hand it to you. Just quickly in terms of format, after Brad's spoken, I will have a bit of a conversation with him. I want to share a few Indian examples to pick your brains on what you think works for us in an Indian context. And I want to make it participative, so I'll also come to you and ask you for any questions or views that you have. Thank you. Over to you, Brad.
Yeah, thank you, Anuj. It is an absolute delight to be with you. Thank you all for coming. It's one of the joys of my life, actually, was teaching all the Indian students I taught who came to the University of Pittsburgh. Aditya Samani was one of those students, and there was always a challenge. After teaching business ethics for 27, 28 years, I'm still challenged. I don't know the answers. That's why I find this to be such an interesting subject, because I'm continually trying to get better answers. Anuj actually was a wonderful philosopher. He probably doesn't realize it, But in his opening scenario, he actually illustrated 3 major ways that we think about ethics. And actually, behavioral ethicists and neuroscientists are finding that these are actually, can be traced to different parts of our brains. So one way that we think about ethics is what we refer to as deontology perspective, which is that the act itself is ethical or unethical. Doesn't matter what the outcome is, the act itself is what's ethical or unethical. That's one way we think about it. Another way we think about it is by thinking about the outcome. And is the outcome good or bad? And if the outcome is good, then we say that's ethical. Doesn't matter what it took to get that outcome, but if the outcome is good, then we've been ethical. If the outcome is bad, then we've been unethical. So 2 very different ways of thinking about ethics. The third way is what we refer to as a virtue approach, which is, how do I feel about myself? You talked about whether or not you actually went through the red light. Do I feel like I was a good person or not a good person? So that's the virtue approach. And sometimes those 3 can give us different answers, and that's one of the things that makes ethics so difficult. In the United States, I would argue, and I'm writing an editorial, we'll see if it actually shows up in any of the US papers, but I'm currently arguing that in the United States, you can identify voters for president based on these ethical categories or theories. So there's a group of folks who are deontologists who believe that the act itself is the ethical or unethical action. We have 2, I would argue, highly flawed candidates running for president of the United States. So there's a group of folks who think that voting for either one would be unethical. However, that's a group who also believes that the act of voting itself is an important ethical act. So I have to vote, but I can't vote for either candidate. And that group is trying desperately to figure out what to do in the next 4 months. Then there's a group of folks who believe the ethics are based on the outcome. And so they might say, I don't know if I like that candidate might be unethical, but I like what they would do as president. So even though I don't like the person or think the person is bad, I'll get the outcome I want. And so you should vote for the person who you think will give you the outcome you want. And so they're not necessarily excited about voting for one of those 2 people, but they're willing to say, yeah, the outcome's going to be better for that person, so I'll vote for that person. The third group requires us to move away from pure philosophical ethics and move to what is now referred to as behavioral ethics, which is a study of what we do, not necessarily what we think is right. And one of the things we know that we do as individuals from a lot of research is that we rationalize. To make ourselves feel good about ourselves, we often say what I've done is okay for a whole number of reasons, and we could spend an hour and I could go through all the different ways that we rationalize. My argument is you can't be enthusiastic about either one of the US presidential candidates unless you are rationalizing. So when I see different people talking about the presidential candidates, I can put them in one of those 3 camps. So the American can't be here telling you that we're great and you need to learn from us. However, I know that you have challenges. For the 17 years I taught at the University of Pittsburgh, when I had a lot of students from India, I got a lot of questions that I know Anuj is going to ask me here in just a minute. And I didn't have great answers for those questions. Aditya will be kind enough to say that maybe I provided some help, but there were a lot of those questions that I didn't have good answers for. Well, I remember going and teaching in Bratislava, which is in Slovakia. About 2 years after the wall had come down and communism had ended. And the University of Pittsburgh had a program, and we were going to teach an MBA program, and in that MBA program, I was going to teach a business ethics class. Now, what do you think of when you think of communism or Slovakia when it comes to business ethics? You probably don't think highly ethical. So I thought, well, this is going to be a challenge. So the first thing I did when I got there is I said to my students, well, I'm not going to be the American coming and telling you what to do. Why don't you tell me what keeps you from being able to do business the way you want to, not the way I want to. What keeps you from being able to do business the way you want to? And it was really interesting. We ended up spending about 4 hours. I had thought we'd talk for half an hour. We spent 4 hours talking about the things that kept them from doing business the way they wanted to do business. Number one, corrupt legal system. They said the very system we should go to get relief from is corrupt itself. So how are we supposed to do business right when we can't even go to our legal system? Second thing, no good role models. They said, in the United States, even though you have some bad companies, bad business ethics, you do have some companies that you can really point to that say they have really good ethics. They do things right. And so I can model myself after that company or that leader. They said, in Slovakia, we have no one that we can model ourselves after. And then they had several other examples of things that kept them from it. I've been fortunate to teach in lots of places around the world. I spent a lot of time teaching in Brazil. Brazil's another country where people tend to think that ethics are questionable. If you look at Transparency International, which puts out something called the Corruption Index, Brazil doesn't do particularly well, i.e. they're high in corruption. One thing I took away from my experiences with my Indian students, with my experiences in Brazil, with my experiences in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, is that most people want to do the right thing. You go around the world, people want to do the right thing. In fact, I started teaching in Brazil in 2000. It was a time when there weren't very many Americans who were very interested in hearing what I had to say in my MBA program. Because if you recall, that was the time that if you started a website, you got people to come to your website, you become a multimillionaire, you didn't have to make any money. You just had to go public and everybody would buy. And so talking about ethics was not a course that very many of my students were interested in hearing about. They wanted to go create their websites so they could become multimillionaires. And I went to Brazil and started teaching, and it was one of those times where you felt like you were in the desert and you were bringing water to these people in the desert. They were so desperate to hear, how can we possibly do the right thing because we want to? That's the sense I get from India. You absolutely want to do the right thing. So what are those things keeping us from being able to do that? And I think we'll talk about some of those things. But I think the important thing to realize is a thought that I love from Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead was one of my favorite anthropologists, and she said the following: never doubt that a small group of committed individuals can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So, if you want to change the world, you can. And I believe it can be done, and I think some of the things we're going to talk about that keep you from doing that can be overcome. Now, I'll just tell you very quickly what this book is about that I'm kind of talking about these days. I took ethical dilemmas from my executive MBA, several hundred, and one of the things I've noticed over the years is that they tend to be similar. So I wanted to know if there were just kind of a certain number of basic ethical dilemmas that people face. Because my executive MBAs don't want to hear about philosophy. They want to hear about practical solutions to difficult problems. And essentially, I took several hundred, did qualitative analysis, and found that while there are different colors, stripes, shapes, flavors, there are fundamentally 13 ethical dilemmas that people face. And the important thing is, it's not just about intentions when it comes to ethics. It's about skills. And if you want to be a great gymnast, or cricket player, or name whatever it is, a great singer, it takes work, it takes effort, it takes practice. If you want to be a great business leader who is an ethical role model, it takes work, it takes learning. And so the book that I have is called The Business Ethics Field Guide, and it actually talks about how you can build those skills. With that, let's get into some of the difficult ones.
Not very difficult, Brian, I'll keep it easy. So building on your Slovakia example that you said, when you're living in that case in a tough legal, corrupt legal system, I think what you're saying is that ethics or your choices are a function of the system you're working with, because that's the choices get limited by that. Let me talk about first, and I think most of you know about the Volkswagen emission scandal that happened in the US, and they fudged their test reports out there. And I think that finds a mirror to many such, almost every industry in India, in the sense that they didn't do anything different from what every single competitor was doing. I think some more have been caught, some haven't been, but it was pretty much the lay of the land or the benchmark that's the normal operating practice in a particular industry. If I just met somebody from real estate. We take any industry, I'm just taking real estate as an example in Bombay City. It's a tough business. There are a lot of payouts you got to do. There's a lot of corruption in the system. If you got to pay that out, you got to earn that back. And how do you earn that back? Except by constructing more than you're allowed to construct, or by scamming your buyer and something like that. So I think there's two situations or options that you're dealing with. Scenario A is that everybody is following the rule, and you are breaking the rule to get a competitive advantage. And should you or should you not? And for the right-minded, that's an easy decision. But more often than not, scenario 2 is into play, that everybody's breaking the rule. And if you don't break the rule, you're not going to be able to perform. Your business is not going to work. That's a tougher one for the most ethical guy. So in that kind of a situation that works, I mean, probably that's the case Volkswagen found itself in. That's the case many of our businesses and companies find themselves in. What's your take, and how does one deal with that? And what does your book tell us?
Well, that does happen to be one of the 13 ethical dilemmas. What do you do when either you have an unfair competitive advantage, or you have a competitor who has an unfair competitive advantage? And one of the unfair competitive advantages is when you cheat. So how do you deal with it when your competitors are cheating and giving themselves the competitive advantage? This is very, very common. It's common for students. If you've got your fellow students, if you've got, like in a lot of schools where you have a forced curve, only so many students can get A's, only so many students can get B's, or 1s or 2s. How do you deal with it when you know that your fellow students are cheating? So this is something that starts when you're young, and it doesn't change when you're the CEO of Volkswagen. And this is, again, where intention is not enough. Because as you said, what do you do? And this is where the ability to be entrepreneurial, to be innovative, to have skills is really important. I'll just tell you one story. So Paul O'Neill, who is one of my business heroes, Paul O'Neill was the chairman and CEO of Alcoa. And he had a situation where he wanted to acquire an aluminum making business in another country, a country that had good environmental laws, but did not enforce them very well. And so he negotiated to buy this company. However, he reduced the price significantly in terms of what he was willing to pay, because he said, we're going to have to do about $1 billion worth of environmental remediation. Meanwhile, he had a competitor who he knew was going to pay more, but he also knew that the competitor would not do any environmental remediation, and he knew that the country wouldn't do anything about that. So here's a classic example of, what are you going to do? Your competitor is willing to take the shortcut, you're not willing to take the shortcut. Now, I'm not telling you what he did will work every time, but at least in Paul's mind, shining light on that situation was the solution. And so he wrote a letter to the CEO of the competitor who was also vying to buy the company. And in that letter, he said, if you buy that company, we will monitor very closely to ensure that you live up to the environmental laws of that country, even if the government officials don't monitor it. And if you don't, we will make it very public that you are not living up to those environmental standards. It so happened that that company withdrew their offer, and Alcoa ended up buying that company and then did the environmental remediation. So I'm not telling you that will work every time, but as long as we take the path that says, well, if they have an unfair advantage, I have no choice, then that's what we will get. It takes leaders who have imagination. So one of my colleagues who teaches business ethics, her name is Pat Werhane. She wrote a book called Moral Imagination. I remember when I first saw that title, I thought, I'm not sure that's a good thing. Moral imagination. I think some of my students have moral imagination in ways that I don't think were particularly good. But Pat's idea is that sometimes there is a third way. There is another path that takes imagination, takes leadership. Not easy, but if you want to get to a higher plane, you'll never get there without doing the hard work.
Sure, thanks, Mary. Let me bring you to a different question on this one. Again, we are talking about ethics as if it's black or white, it's binary, it is right and it is wrong. Sometimes it's not binary, it's a continuum. Or let me ask you, do you think it's a continuum, or does it have to be one side or the other of the fence? For example, do ethical leaders need to compromise? And let me give you a scenario again. Let me take an Indian system. I think we all know that the Indian politics or governance or government systems, there is a lot of inbuilt corruption in that system. Now, any election, take the last election for example, was fought on one of the platforms was on cleaning out corruption. And any government that comes into power, let's say it comes into power with the mandate to wipe out corruption, and you have this leader who comes in to wipe out corruption, but what does he walk into? He walks into a system that is highly corrupt. And the system comprises a lot of business, whether it's corporation or whether it's a government, the same principle. You have corruption through, you have a lot of bureaucrats, a lot of people in power who are corrupt. And if I follow a zero tolerance policy, does that mean on day one I wipe it all out? Do I sack every single guy for every single corruption that I see, even from then on? The system will not function, will collapse. Or do I pick and choose my battles? Do I therefore start compromising on some, allowing that, turn a blind eye to that, while going after some? So is it an incremental change in cleanliness that I'm looking at and compromising? Or does ethics have to be 0-1?
Sometimes the black and white is truly black and white, and it's really easy. And we wouldn't spend too much time talking about those. So there are some that are really black and white, they're really easy. But most of the ones we're going to talk about are difficult. And there is a continuum. And the ability to just come into a system that's highly corrupt and say, I'm going to clean it up and we're not going to have anything go wrong is fairly unrealistic. At least I'm not aware of anybody who's ever managed to do that. Is anyone aware of anybody who's managed to do that? No? Okay. If you think of it, let me know, because I'd be curious to hear. So that means it's got to be a process. Now, one of the big issues in a lot of parts of the world, and I've certainly heard about it from my students in India, is the issue of bribery, right? Kickbacks and bribery. If you want something, you have to pay. The countries that have somehow effectively dealt with this have generally done it through a process. Oftentimes they've said, well, why is it that there always has to be this bribery? And generally it's because the people who are in those jobs don't get paid enough to, even feed a family. So they've got a high degree of incentive to try to get kickbacks or bribes. And so those who have effectively dealt with it have said, folks, if we are going to get rid of this, we have to increase wages. Because as long as the incentive is so huge, you're not going to get rid of corruption. So we've got to increase wages. During which time we may turn a blind eye to the behavior. However, we're going to make it clear to folks that behavior will end. So after a period of 4 or 5 years, when we get wages up to a level that we consider to be decent, at that stage, we will take a very strong stance against anyone in those jobs accepting a bribe. Now at that point, the job has become something that you value because the wage has gone up. So now you have a strong incentive not to accept a bribe because you're going to lose a job which now has value to you. So I think there is a process. And if you also look at organizations, and there are lots of examples. I don't have to come to India for those examples. I got plenty of examples in America of incredibly corrupt organizations, but corrupt organizations that have turned around and have actually become fairly ethical organizations. There are some decent standards out there. So, of course, the US has had major problems. After some of those problems, we've put folks together who've thought about those issues. And in 1991, we put out the 7 steps of due diligence. 7 things that companies should do to try to be proactive in creating an ethical environment. And those were helpful. And you say, wait, Dr. Agel, you just said 1991. I think we had some problems in the early 2000s. It didn't seem to solve it all, did it? And that's correct. So in 2004, we came out with some more steps of due diligence, some things companies should do. Primarily is because we figured out the 1991 steps of due diligence dealt mainly with the media, or the middle and the bottom of the organization. Of course, most of the major problems in the early 2000s were at the top of the organization. So those issues then dealt with the top of the organization. And companies in general have done better since then. Now I know you're going to come back and say, well, wait a second, Dr. Agel, that was 2004. You had some other problems in 2007, 2008. Well, those problems tended not to be at the corporate level. Those tended to be at the institutional level, the financial markets, the finance companies. So there are different problems that require different solutions, and they're a process. So I wish it were so easy that we could just say black and white, don't do this, do that. But for most of us, it's going to be a process. It's going to be a work to get higher on the mountain. And so it requires people who are willing to do that work.
I have a few more questions, but before I do that, I want to keep bringing some of you into the conversation. We are lucky to have Mrs. Vasudeva here with us. She's retired now, but she used to head Hindustan Petroleum, which is, I'm sure, a very large responsibility. So Vasudeva, any questions or experience that you want to share with us?
Well, I think in a way, in a public sector environment, there are many watchdogs. So I think for people who work in that kind of a system, there are too many downsides to not doing the right thing. And of course, things do happen, but then there is a system in place which takes care of it and sets an example for the others as well. At times it is felt as being overly restrictive, but I think if you look at the general Indian scenario, maybe it is a good thing that there are a lot of people watching you. I have actually another question for you. When you mentioned that some countries have been able to progress towards reducing the corruption by improving the level of wages over a period of time. But do you not think that it's also important right from the beginning to have some sense of fear in the people that they are being watched, and not necessarily only when the wages become good enough for it being a detriment to lose the job? Because many times one does feel in our country that it could be that that is one of the reasons that they're not earning enough, and this becomes a secondary way of getting an income. But there seems to be no fear of any reprimand, which also makes it so widely prevalent. So it would be nice to hear your views on that.
Yeah, so I think there have to be rules that people understand that if they break those rules, there are consequences. And so, at least in the two countries I think of that have kind of gone through that process, they haven't said that there aren't consequences for breaking the rules. They've just sort of ratcheted it up over time. So they've said yes, there are consequences, but they didn't enforce them quite as much, or they didn't put as many resources into the watchdogs. But as they raised the wages, then they put more into it. So I talked about the 7 steps of due diligence. The first one is having a clear code of conduct. So there's no getting away from that. You have to make your standards clear to everyone. The difficulty, I think, is if you make your standards clear, but you don't support what it takes to actually make that happen, I think people look at you and say, you're not really serious about it. But certainly you need to do that. And you need to have the watchdogs. We don't have exact percentages, but in general, those studies that have been done have shown that about 10% of people will do the right thing no matter what. There's this group of folks who just, whether it's from religious perspective or whatever perspective, they just will do the right thing no matter what circumstance you put them in. And then there's about a 10% group, 10% that they'll do whatever it takes to get whatever they want. And there's very little you can do other than try to determine who those folks are. Which leaves about 80%. And that 80% can be swayed a great deal by what you do as an organization. So if you send strong signals to them, and if you have watchdogs, and if you create a culture of ethics, and we could talk a lot about the different kinds of things that leaders can do to create a culture of ethics. And by the way, it doesn't take that long. You might think it takes a long time, but it actually can be done fairly quickly. I worked as a consultant for Česká spořitelna. I used to be able to say that. It's the largest bank in the Czech Republic. And the CEO actually reached out to me before they had any problems. But it was right at the beginning of the financial crisis, and he said, I'm really worried about what people at our organization may do. And so he brought me in. We actually did a survey of their employees on the ethical culture of their organization, and it didn't come out very good. And so I worked with their top management team. We instituted a number of things, and a year and a half later, we did another post-survey, and the increase was dramatic. And they also had a lot of success stories in that year and a half, where they discovered things that were going wrong. They got rid of some folks. They put in some programs. They had a big problem with sexual harassment, which I think we might be getting to. And because of the programs they put in, they found out who the problems were and were able to get rid of those problems. So you can actually change things fairly quickly in an organization.
Talking of watchdogs, we have one of India's biggest watchdogs with us. We have Sudhir Soni, who heads Ernst & Young's assurance and audit practice. And so he's a watchdog to many, many corporates out there. Should I repeat that? Was that audible? Was it audible or should I? Yeah. Okay. So Sudhir, as the auditor of many companies, while we are grappling with ethical dilemmas, as you as the guy who's whipping us to make sure we behave, tell us what any of your experiences or views or questions if you need.
Thanks, Anuj. I don't claim to be India's biggest watchdog, but I'll still answer you. I think in my practice, we do face ethical issues almost day in, day out. And as an accountant, I think there are 2 or 3 areas I see this very often. In the areas of financial reporting and disclosure, we see this very often in subjective areas where companies are making judgments, your decisions, are you reporting right to your investors, to your stakeholders. The second important area I find, which we encounter, is compliance. Compliance with law. And I put this into 3 categories. You have one which is non-compliance to one extreme, where we encounter cases of non-compliance. And that, as you said, is not difficult. That's clearly black. But the more difficult are in that range of what I would call letter of law and spirit of law. And that's where we often face a challenge in the interpretations. And I have a whole range of clients. So I have those who read the letter of the law to me, and I have those who read the spirit of the law. So that's, I think, a set of challenges that I face. The third that we face in our practice very often is structuring. Structuring which is designed, so which is legal, appropriate, but which is designed to achieve a result. So you have companies, and we advise companies, so some companies come and ask us for advice to say, I don't want to consolidate my losses. I know they are mine, but I don't want to consolidate. So find a way to do that. So there is a degree of ethics even in giving that advice and whether we should advise or not. But what I find positive, if I may say, over the last 2 to 3 years, due to regulation in India, changes in the corporate law, requirements for whistleblowing, I certainly am more positive and I'm much more optimistic. The tone in boardrooms I see today is much more driven towards compliance. So there can always be a question of degree, but what I see is a lot of positivity towards ethics and compliance.
Thanks, Lee. I have many questions, but actually I want to give all of you a chance. So.
You mentioned something about US dealing with corruption. So do you think it's different how China handled it, the same problem? How different was it from the US, the way they addressed the corruption issue?
I honestly don't know the Chinese system that well, so I can't really tell you about that.
Yes.
I think people often misunderstand the difference between morals, values, and ethics. Values are what we are taught at home. Morals are a set of rules that we use to make the decision of between what we think is right and wrong, and ethics being a more external set of rules being placed upon us. In that context, do you see that there is a vast difference in the world between, say, the United States, between Czechoslovakia, Brazil, India, even the students that you have taught from various countries, that they came to the table with a different set in mind of ethics that they were subjected to prior to them becoming your students?
Yeah, so you started with suggesting that, I think you suggested that values and morals are something that you learn at home, sort of fundamental and that ethics was more sort of societal rules, etc., or societal norms. From my experience, values and morals around the world are very, very similar. If I went into one of your homes, I'd probably hear the same thing that you're teaching your children, that my wife and I are teaching our children. So I think that is very similar across the world. Now, countries have different histories, and some of those historical artifacts continue to play an important role in what happens in the current society. So there are certain countries, for example, there's some research that shows that where countries have been taken over by another power, people don't trust the system. So there's a really interesting research that's been done where you ask a person, let's say you're driving in a car and your good friend is driving, but you know that your friend has been drinking. And you hit another car. And the police comes and says to you, your friend seems a little off. Was your friend drinking alcohol? What will you say? Depends on whether or not you live in a country that has been taken over, interestingly enough. You can look historically. So countries, for example, like the United States, that have never been taken over by a foreign power, most people will say, yes, I should tell the police officer that my friend was drinking. Meanwhile, in most countries that have been taken over by a foreign power, they don't trust the authorities, so they'll say, no, 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 my friend was not drinking at all. So you have people from different countries, different cultures that still value honesty, still value friendship, but will react differently because of that historical artifact. And in that same way, if I trust the legal system, if I trust the justice system, I'm much more willing to do certain things than if I don't trust that system. So I think what we're working toward is trying to bring those values that we all share and make them work in systems that are affected by historical artifacts and cultural issues and issues of corruption and issues of wealth inequality, and there are a lot of things that affect how you fix the system.
We have time for one last question here.
Okay, I'll ask the question and allow me to elaborate upon that. I want to know what is your view on victimless crime? I'll elaborate. Anu spoke about real estate and you spoke about bribery. Intertwined, but I have a different perspective. It's not that you always bribe and try to make it up by doing a scam or doing building more. For example, I come from real estate, and we have a foreign partner which is consistently ranked among the most admired real estate company in the world, called Bernardo Realty Trust.
The most what?
Most admired
companies.
Actually, recently they ranked #1 among the most admired company by Fortune magazine. The point is here that Kaushik Basu, the chief economist of World Bank, who was economic advisor, he also suggested that bribe giver should not be penalized, bribe taker should be penalized, and he talked about victimless crime. Here what happens, that the government bureaucrats, they do not have a disincentive to work, not to work. So, for example, you have a loan of $100 million. If thing is delayed by 1 month, you lose $1 million. You think, okay, you pay $100,000 and get the work done, everybody's a winner. And unlike 2G scam or coal scam where people, there is a victim. I pay, I don't deserve, I get somebody who deserves, he did not, he's a victim. Here there is no victim. So he says probably it is good for the economy. But I think if I don't
Sorry,
pay,
I'm just going to ask you to come quickly to the question.
yeah, I just,
What's the point?
Yeah, point is that, do you think there is something called victimless crime?
By definition, I say no. There's not if there's no victim, there's no crime. So by definition, there is no such thing as a victimless crime. However, what you're arguing is, or suggesting, is that there are times that breaking the rules can be an ethical thing. So, Yeah, it's suggesting it's a possibility. You can find examples of that. In fact, one of the chapters in my book deals with when is it correct to break the rules. So there are times. Most of us would argue that Martin Luther King Jr. was a great leader. Gandhi was a great leader. Well, they broke a lot of rules. So I think there are times when that can be the case. However, the situation you're looking at, the problem is if we go along and do what you just talked about, the system doesn't get fixed. And at some point, you have to fix the system. And that's the problem, because in that case, there actually is a victim. You can't point to him in that case, but the system doesn't get fixed. And when the system doesn't get fixed, the victims are the folks you don't see. And so you really have to fix the system.
I'm going to squeeze in one last question. Gentleman in front. I'm sorry, I draw off lottery.
I'll speak a little louder. There is a school of thought which believes that ethics is also good business sense, in the sense that companies which are ethical also are more profitable. To me, this is a bit contradictory, because that really takes away from the pain or the conflict of actually having to live up to your standards. If it was just as simple as that, why would you need a separate justification? I'd like your comments on either side of this debate.
Yeah, absolutely. Spent a lot of time on that question. I've done a lot of research on that question. The reality is that you can be highly successful in business being unethical, and you can be highly successful in business being ethical. I think the weight of the argument is on the side of being ethical, but it's not a big difference, i.e., there are lots of ways either way. So while I totally believe you can be ethical and be profitable, it's also sometimes much harder. You actually have to work harder to do it that way. Fortunately, I think there are people out there who do that extra work and make the world a better place because they are doing it correctly. Now, there is a really good economics argument. If I had some of you perhaps are econ majors out there once upon a time, there's a body of research called transactions cost economics, and I won't go through it, but the basic idea of transaction cost economics is that trust is an absolute lubricant of the economic system. And when you have corruption, and when you can't trust any of your partners, be they your customers, your suppliers, etc., then there's a huge cost. You have to check up on them, all kinds of, there's costs before negotiation, after negotiation, there are lots of costs. And so it actually hurts your economy to a great extent. And that same cost actually happens within an organization as well. So I think you can make a really good case that ethics is better business, but it doesn't make it easier business. And sometimes, unfortunately, doing it the unethical way can make you good profits in the short run. So I think you have to be committed to being ethical, not just because it's better business, but because it's better for everyone as well.
Thank you. I actually have more questions, as I know some of you do.
Yeah.
But as they say, a good meal is one way. At the end of it, you yet want to eat more. So I'm going to use that to wrap this up. Thank you.
Excuse me, one question I have, which is a general one.
Go ahead.
Which is on the 2008 financial crisis.
Yes.
The complete ethical failure on all the parts, including the government, boards, sorry if you don't mind, accounting firms, rating agencies, they all failed in their job. Is that a failure of ethics there?
Absolutely.
It costs us a lot.
Absolutely.
And it's still costing us.
Absolutely.
So
That was easy. Yes, I agree with what you said.
So
Yes,
how do we change it?
the banks failed, the rating agencies failed, the government failed. It was a perfect storm.
But we are legalizing it. It's still being practiced.
Okay, I'm going to end it there, but what I'm going to say on that one, I think that's a good question. And I think, I'll come to you, Mr. Ramadurai. I think that again proves the point that ethics is profitable and lack of ethics you think is being profitable. In the long run, you realize how detrimental it was. Mr. Ramadurai, last one.
Just curious because you said that certain parts of the brain sort of dictate how you react or whatever. I was wondering whether it's healthier in a human being to be ethical. Really, being happier? Is that
Very
something
nice
that's born
question.
out?
It's a wonderful question to end on. So one of my good friends, Kim Cameron, who's a professor at the University of Michigan, started a movement called the Positive Organizational Scholarship Movement. Now, it comes out of the positive psychology movement. Kim works at the organizational level, and so he studies virtue at the organizational level. So he studies things like organizational humility, organizational love, organizational forgiveness. It's really fascinating. And there are now hundreds of researchers who are looking at these questions. And they are finding that when you create those virtues in an organization, the organization does much better. But he originally drew on the positive psychology work, which is what you're talking about in terms of individual, and I remember learning some really interesting things from his presentations. There is a rhythm to our body, and when we are living according to our values and we're attempting to be virtuous, there's an interesting synergy or togetherness that comes with that, and the findings in terms of personal health are dramatic. I'll just tell you, one study that he likes to talk about, there was a group of nuns who started the nunnery in their 20s, and they did a survey and found, how many were really just absolutely dedicated to wanting to be a Catholic nun for their lives. And there were a whole bunch of questions, but how many were just kind of there because they didn't really know what else to do with life, etc. The correlation between how much they were dedicated to that's what they wanted to do and their longevity was absolutely dramatic. About 70%, I believe, of those who were totally dedicated to wanting to become a nun, when the study was done, 55 years later, were still alive. And like 0% of the others were still alive. It was just absolutely dramatic. So in terms of personal health, this is not my research, but other researchers have found that it's absolutely critical.
Thank you. I want to thank Professor Eagle for making the trip to India and taking our time to talk to us while on this trip. I got the privilege of having a sneak peek at your book, and I can tell you it's really interesting. So while we've had this conversation today, it's a very small piece of the insight that his book presents. An insight not theoretical, but very practical, very relevant to actual use in our businesses. I want to thank all of you for being a great audience and for the questions and for the sharing that you've done. Thank you, Aditya and Everest, as always, for supporting and bringing this program to us and to your team out there. And on behalf of Ananta Aspen, I also want to thank the Ananta Aspen team and look forward to seeing more of you at more of our events. Thank you very much.